This case takes place in the year of 2000 in the Setagaya region of Tokyo in Japan. The Miyazawa family was considered a typical Japanese family. The family consisted of four people: 44-year-old Mikio Miyazawa, his 41-year-old wife Yasuko, and their two children, Nina and Rei. Mikio worked full time at a London based marketing firm in just one of their many offices around many different countries, and they dealt with many high profile business clients like Microsoft. All of Mikio's colleagues had stated that he was extremely friendly and he had this ability to get on with anyone that he would meet. Mikio's wife, Yasuko, was a teacher and was said to make a positive impression on everyone that she knew. She was known to be a loving mother who spent much of her time caring for her children. Her friends and colleagues all stated that she was an extremely kind person. 8-year-old Nina was known to be a fun and playful young girl who enjoyed playing sports and ballet. 6-year-old Ray, who was a seemingly normal young boy, he had developed a speech impediment when he was very young. And over the years, his family was trying to get him professional help regarding that, but as of that time, they weren't that successful with it. Mikio and Yasuko had moved into their family home in Setagaya in 1990, as it had been an increasingly popular area for families to move into at that time. It was considered safe and secure for families to raise their young children. Setagaya itself was the second largest district within Tokyo and was just a short distance from the main city. It was very different to the surrounding city like areas. It was quite suburban and residential. The family home itself was an impressive building. Looking at it from the outside, it would appear as though it was just one large house. But in fact, it was actually split into two separate houses. Miyazawa family lived in one part, meanwhile Yasuko's mother, her sister, and brother-in-law lived in the other. From the inside of the building, there was no connection between the two properties. All seven of them were very close knit. There was a park located just behind the house, which had been placed there a few years before, and there had been talks of this park being extended over the coming months. And because of this planned construction to extend the park, the vast majority of the residents in the houses surrounding the Miyazawa family had moved out or were in the process of doing so. At the time of this case taking place, there had been only four families in the residential community: the Miyazawas, their family next door, and two other families living just down the street from them. And because of this, it remained an extremely quiet area. The main thing that the Miyazawa family would notice in their day to day lives would be just how busy the park behind their house would get. Despite the plans for the expansion, it was still open and particularly bustling. It's worth noting that the only thing that separated their property from this park was a fence. In the week prior to this case taking place, the Miyazawa family has had a particular encounter with a group of teenagers who were making a lot of noise in the park. Mikio decided to confront this group in an attempt to get them to quiet down, and this confrontation was witnessed by a number of people. These witnesses claimed that the group of teenagers who Mikio was talking to, they were actually a part of a group called the Bosuzuk, which were a form of a biker gang in Japan. This confrontation, although it didn't turn violent or sour at all, and the issue was left at that. Since the construction was planned to be continuing around this area over the coming months, the Miyazawa family had been planning on moving away from the area as well. But they wouldn't be doing so until the early months of the following year, meaning that they would be one of the last families left in the area. In the lead up to the New Year's, there would be a number of strange things happening around the neighborhood. In the summer of that year, the entire neighborhood had been disturbed by the realization that there were a number of local animals being kidnapped and tortured, and their bodies were just left out in the open. This was strange in itself for the residents, but then specifically for the Miyazawa family, on Christmas of that year, Yasuko had told her father in law that she had been noticing a car being parked in front of their house on numerous occasions. It was always the same car, and she thought it was extremely strange since there were so many people that were moving out of the area. And the only time people would park in that area was if they were visiting the park behind their house. And if that was the case, There were much more accessible areas to park rather than outside of their house because parking there would require people to jump over the fence to get to the park, which would be quite insufficient and inconvenient. Now, before we get into the actual day of the crime, these are some of the suspicious accounts and sightings that took place in the days leading up to the crime. On 27th of December 2000, a man had been spotted by a passerby walking around the Miyazawa family home. Initially, it wasn't a concern because of how close the house was located to the park, but in hindsight, they considered it strange. The man was said to be in his 40s, but aside from that, there wasn't really a lot of details known. On 29th of December 2000, a local resident had seen an odd looking man at the nearby station, which was located just a few miles away from the Miyazawa family home. This man didn't look familiar to the witness and was dressed in what they described as a skater outfit, which didn't seem appropriate at all for the weather at that time. It was believed that this same man had later been spotted buying a sashimi knife in a nearby shopping area on the same day. The following day, a man who had matched the same description was spotted around a mile away from the Miyazawa's family house. Now, getting into the day of the crime. 30th of December 2000. It was supposed to be another fateful day for the Miyazawa family. They had been preparing themselves for the upcoming New Year celebrations. Aside from that, they were having a pretty normal day. At around 6 p.m. that evening, the four Miyazawa family members headed out to a nearby shopping center. This was later supported by a neighbor who had driven past their home at around 6:30 and didn't see their car in the driveway. At around 7 p.m., Yasuko visited her mother next door and had a conversation which wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Following this, Nina had headed over to her family's house next door to watch a TV program with her grandma and stayed until around 9:30 p.m. The next known point in the timeline had been an email read by Mikio at around 10:40 p.m. The email was regarding his work and his account was password protected, so he had to have been the one accessing it. This was the last known movement of any of the four members of the family. A witness claimed that they heard a loud argument coming from inside their house somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m. that night. They claimed that they didn't hear any other noises and simply put it down to being a couple's heated argument. At around 11:30 p.m., one of the family members next door to the Miyazawa heard a loud bang coming from the other side of the building. This noise came from the side where the Miyazawas lived. Around the same time, a neighbor recalled spotting a man walking quickly down the path located next to the family's house. Aside from these few things, the truth behind what occurred inside the family's home would not be discovered for hours. The following morning, on 31st of December 2000, Yasko's mother attempted to call next door to see if they all wanted to do something that afternoon, but the call wasn't going through. It would later turn out that the phone lines to the home had been cut by someone the previous evening, and upon realizing that something was wrong with the phones, Yasko's mother headed round to her daughter's front door and rang the bell, but no one was answering. That is when she used her set of keys to let herself into the house. As she entered the home, it was very quiet. She walked further inside, and that is when she spotted Mikio's body at the bottom of the stairs. Mikio Miyazawa was stabbed multiple times and was left at the foot of the staircase. Clearly in disbelief and shock, Yasuko's mother mustered up the courage to walk up the stairs to see where her daughter and grandchildren were. And just at the top of the stairs, she discovered the remains of her daughter Yasuko and her granddaughter Nina. Both of them were victims of a brutal attack. It was later discovered that they had been stabbed dozens of times, a lot more than Mikio. Lastly, she found 6-year-old Ray in his bedroom. He was the only victim who was not stabbed, but rather his cause of death was determined to be strangulation. After this extremely upsetting discovery, Yasuko's mother immediately contacted the police to report what she had found. Immediately, this case was a huge shock, not only to the responding authorities but also to the general public. Since it was so brutal and distressing, the public were left wondering why would someone attack this family in their own home and who could have been responsible. As the authorities searched through the crime scene in an attempt to establish what happened, The relatives who lived next door started to recount to the officers everything that they could remember, and the main thing that seemed unusual to them was the loud thud that they heard at around 11:30 p.m. And they remembered that because of a TV show that they were watching at that time. Police theorized that the thud was probably when Mikio was confronting the attacker, as the wounds on his body would suggest that he had been in an altercation prior to his death. And the third that they heard may have been Mikio being knocked to the bottom of the staircase. In terms of the wounds found on Mikio, the stab wounds appear to have been directed mainly at his neck. The knife wounds had matched a sashimi knife that was found at the crime scene. And if you recall the sighting that had placed earlier, that unusually dressed man who purchased a sashimi knife, police believe that that man was somehow connected with this attack and brought the knife into the house with him. The attack on Mikio was so brutal that parts of knife were stuck in his head. After that, it is believed that the attacker ended up using a knife from the family's kitchen to attack Yasuko and Nina. In terms of the remains of Yasuko and Nina, it was believed that both of them were in the loft room watching TV when the attacker entered the property. The loft room was accessed by a ladder on the first floor where the other bedrooms were, and both of their remains were found at the bottom of this ladder. As I said previously, both of them were brutally attacked and were stabbed way more times than Mikio, and police declared it as an overkill. Rei, the youngest child, was the only one who was not stabbed. And this initially was quite confusing for the investigators, but they ultimately came up with the theory that he may have been the first one to be attacked. Police found that on the same day, an unnamed man who appeared to be in his 30s was admitted into a medical center in a place called Toboniko, which was just a train ride away from Setagaya. This man was admitted into the medical center, but he refused to provide them with his name or just how he got injured. Medical staff found that he had a severe wound on his hand, which was so bad that they could see his bones. And the man acted strangely calm and rather suspicious by refusing to answer any questions. He was treated and discharged despite his strange behavior because at that time, the medical staff was completely unaware of the attacks that happened back in Setagaya. Back at the murder scene, the investigators already had a lot to work with. Both of the murder weapons were found at the crime scene, both with the blood of victims still on them. It was also found that the first aid kit in the house has been opened, and it was believed that it was either Yasuko or Nina who had opened it. There were small traces of blood on some of the bandage strips, which would later be tested and confirmed to have been Nina's blood. When it came to the DNA evidence left behind by the killer, there was a lot. The attacker had left unflushed feces in the upstairs bathroom, which was later tested, and they found evidence of a certain food that was likely last eaten by the attacker. Investigators found a number of other evidences like DNA evidence and footprints all over the house, covered in both blood and dirt. As a result of these clear footprints, authorities determined that the killer had been wearing a specific size of trainers. Those trainers were pretty popular in Japan at that time, but it was discovered that that specific shoe size was only available in Korea. So there was a slight chance that the attacker was not from Japan or they had visited Korea at some point. A number of towels and women's sanitary products were found around the scene with blood on them. Later tests would determine that the blood on them did not belong to any of the victims. As a result of that, police theorized that Mikio may have managed to injure the attacker before his death. Authorities also found a number of clothing items left behind by the killer. It seemed like the attacker was not worried at all about leaving any evidence behind and that it was done intentionally. The clothing found at the scene was something a skater would wear, including a grey crusher hat, black AirTag jacket, a white and purple long sleeve top, black gloves, multicolored scarf, and a handkerchief. There were multiple blood stains on the shirt, and it was determined that the shirt had been sold by a specific retail chain that had also sold the gloves and the hat. Interesting thing to note is that the handkerchief had been ironed prior to being left behind. Another interesting thing that they found was the water which was used to wash these clothes. At that time, Japan had a soft water system, meaning that there were little to no minerals found in the water aside from a bit of sodium. But the clothes were found to have been washed in hard water, which gave the police another reason to believe that the attacker was not from Japan. In addition to all this information, the attacker had also left behind some other belongings. One thing discovered by the authorities was a small bag, and inside was a piece of grip tape, which was typically used on skateboards. They also found trace elements of a specific cologne, the exact same which had also been found on the handkerchief. The bag was sent for testing, and one of the main things found inside the bag was sand. Sand can be tested in a number of different ways and has the potential to provide a lot of geographical details. And it was found that that specific sand inside the bag was from an area in the southwestern United States, specifically in the region of the Edwards Air Force Base, located just north of Los Angeles. And this just threw investigators away completely. Why would someone all the way from US would commit this brutal attack in Japan? It was also theorized that maybe the attacker was in the Air Force and had been stationed in Tokyo at that time while previously being in the US. Months had passed with the police trying to seek out anyone who had any information. There were numerous leads to follow in terms of people who were seen wearing these type of clothing, but once each of these leads were followed up and tracked down, it became clear to the authorities that all of these clothing items were extremely common by that point. Through the collection of statements from witnesses in the lead up to the incident, authorities had managed to piece together a timeline. They theorized that the attacker had entered the home through the bathroom window on the second story. This window had been on the rear side of the home, just above the fence that separated the property from the park. It would not have been an easy point of entry, and they concluded that if this had been the point of entry, the person must have had a lot of strength to lift themselves up. As I said previously, they believe that the youngest child, Ray, was the first person attacked, likely in his sleep because he was found in his bedroom. They theorized that Mikio was working downstairs as the open work email had suggested, and he must have heard a noise coming from upstairs. So he headed upstairs to investigate the noise, and that is when he came face to face with the attacker and got into a physical altercation with him, which ended with Mikio hitting the bottom of staircase, making that thud sound heard by the relatives next door. They believed that Yasuko and Nina were either attacked on the first floor near the bottom of the ladder or in the loft room upstairs because of the bandages found in the first aid kit with Nina's blood on them. This part is a bit of a mystery as to how Nina's blood got on the first aid kit. Investigators have tried to come up with multiple theories. One of them was that since the attacker broke his knife while attacking Mikio, he wasn't able to fully injure Yasuko and Nina with it, and that is when he went downstairs to retrieve the knife from the kitchen, and this gave Nina enough time to get to the first aid kit. But there is no confirmed way of telling that, as they don't necessarily have a way of knowing exactly what happened inside the house. Different people have suggested different timelines, but possibly the most unnerving piece of information discovered by the investigators was that the attacker had stayed inside the house for hours after murdering the family. They found evidence to suggest that the attacker had rested for a while on the sofa in the living room. Authorities also found 4 ice cream wrappers which were taken from the family's freezer, which were believed to have been eaten by the attacker, and this was confirmed later when they found fingerprints on the wrapper that did not belong to any of the victims. The family's computer had also been used at around 1:18 a.m. on 31st of December, and it appeared that the attacker had visited one of the websites that Mikio had previously bookmarked. The website was of a Shiki theater company, and the attacker had attempted to buy tickets to a show online. It was considered a possibility that this was done intentionally by the attacker to give the impression that the family was still alive, or that he did that as a really cruel joke. The computer was logged into again at around 10:05 a.m. that morning, where Mikio's company website was visited, and so was the website of the school that Yasuko worked at. The attacker browsed these sites for around 10 minutes before unplugging the computer. The attacker, during his stay in the house, had gone around and collected all of the credit cards and ID cards belonging to the family and laid them in the living room near the sofa on which he was resting on. It is believed that he was trying to figure out the PIN codes of the card but then left them behind after realizing that it could be a risk. Another strange thing that the attacker did was filling the bathtub with a number of things, mainly rubbish found from around the house, some receipts from Mikio's work, and also some school documents from Yasko's job. And this is where they found a number of female sanitary towels with the attacker's blood on them. Maybe that was his attempt at hiding the evidence, but then just gave up and didn't care considering how much evidence was left behind. Investigators thought that this may have been a robbery gone wrong, but there was a large amount of money lying around in the house that wasn't touched, so that just threw the robbery theory out of the window. Over the years, a lot of people have posted items online claiming that they are the missing evidence from the crime scene, and majority of them have been proven to be false. The case would go on to become cold and remained unsolved for a few years. And then an update happened in 2006 where the blood that was found at the crime scene, it was tested again and it provided some of the key details about the attacker. It was determined that the attacker was likely mixed race. One of the parents is believed to be Eastern Asian while the other Southern European. In addition to this DNA information, they revisited some other details as well. The man was believed to have been around 5'7" based on the clothing found inside the house, as well as having a very specific size of shoe found in Korea. And they had a type A blood. One of the main things that divides people is exactly how many people are responsible for this. It was reported that a taxi driver had informed authorities that he picked up 3 passengers not very far from the Miyazawa's house around the time when this incident happened. The taxi driver didn't get a name from any of the men and they all stayed silent during the whole trip. The driver specifically remembered these 3 passengers. It was because one of them appeared to be bleeding so much that it left a blood stain on the back seat. He dropped the man off at a nearby station and didn't think about reporting that until he heard about the murders. The authorities had in fact attempted to test this blood found in the back seat of the taxi, but it's not really clear if anything came out of that. Many people have also theorized the potential connection between Mikio confronting those skaters at the park not long before the murders, since all of the clothing found in the house appeared to match the type worn by skaters. But it has also been suggested that this may have been a very clever cover on behalf of the attacker. If he had previously been planning these murders and watching the family's movements, he may have chosen to dress himself to match this description. Over the years, there have been so many theories, including some people also believing that the former members of the South Korean military were involved. But despite there being so many leads and so much evidence being left behind, sadly there hasn't been any break in the case to this day, and the mystery of Miyazawa family massacre still remains unsolved. That's it for this video. If you'd stay till the end, I really appreciate you watching and I will hopefully see you in the next one.